Oh, hey. Hey, didn't see you there. Is that funny? I don't know. A dumb old joke. All right. This is the paraphrasing lecture for writing in psychology. We're going to work on a couple of sort of ongoing learning outcomes, including working on expressing ideas in written formats that reflect psychological concepts and principles. The way that applies here is that in order to express an idea in a written format that is not original, you have to be able to understand the concept or the principle as it's written by the other writer so that you can then paraphrase it into your own writing. So we'll talk about that process today, and that'll lead us mostly into that first paragraph, the first learning outcome there. And of course, in APA style, there's no plagiarism. There's very little direct quotation. We try to avoid that when we can, so paraphrasing is an important skill. And then we'll work in general about on recognizing and developing organization that fits the purpose of a piece of writing. And all that is important for the skill of paraphrasing. The reverse of when and how do I paraphrase is, well, when and how do I directly quote something? So we should cover that first. The only time that I recommend you use direct quotation in writing for psychological science type papers is when it's written so well, so perfectly, that you don't think you could possibly say it better. The author's words are just like poetic in a way that you don't want to change or couldn't repeat, or the meaning can't be captured in some other way, or the impact of the way it's written is so intense that you don't want to reduce it by changing it into your own words. But in general, that doesn't happen very often. There aren't many papers that are written that way, especially now. People used to write a little bit more flowery in the early days of psychology, and if you read older books, if you read older books, you might see some nicer phrases that are worth quoting. But in general, there's not a lot of direct quotation from one article to another because the words are seldom perfect, and in that case, it's nice and easy to paraphrase. For example, have a look at the phrase on the screen here. This is from a paper by Muller and Oppenheimer. It says, although more notes are beneficial at least to a point, if the notes are taken indiscriminately or by mindlessly transcribing content, as is more likely the case on a laptop than when the notes are taken longhand, the benefit disappears. Would you directly quote that? I don't think you need to. In fact, it's quite a wordy version of a statement about the use of laptops versus longhand notes in the classroom. I would say something, I would maybe consider flipping it around would be one way to sort of quickly paraphrase by saying that something like, though people take more notes on laptops, they also tend to mindlessly transcribe. So you probably wouldn't want to say mindlessly transcribe. That could be a case where it might be interesting or useful to directly quote, so put mindlessly transcribe in quotations. Or say something like, the way I started was, laptops can be helpful in the classroom because people will take more notes with a laptop than by writing longhand, but they also sometimes act more like a stenographer than a student. Something like that. Maybe I got a little too wordy with it as well. Up to you. That's the beauty of paraphrasing. You can kind of rewrite it in your own style or in your own voice. You very rarely need to directly quote. So when you translate an idea into your own words, there's a couple things you need to be aware of. So there are three kind of levels of paraphrase. The first is lifting. You don't want to lift. That's when you attempt to paraphrase and don't change enough, and it looks essentially like you're quoting without saying so. You can also commit improper paraphrasing, in which the changes, again, are not quite enough to consider it different. And then we've got proper paraphrasing on the bottom here. So if you ever are having trouble figuring out how do I paraphrase this, how can I tell whether it's different enough, reference your way back to this grid here. So the structure of the, let's say, the sentence or sometimes the paragraph that you're trying to paraphrase cannot be the same and really shouldn't be very similar at all. It should be visibly, clearly different. It's part of the reason I tried to flip that sentence around when I paraphrased it just now on the previous slide. You shouldn't have quotation marks, and you should always give credit as well. So when we think about lifting, we think about using the same structure and not citing it. This is the kind of thing that can become an academic honesty issue. Please don't do that. When we have improper paraphrasing, there's kind of two situations. One is an incomplete or inaccurate citation, and the other is structure that is too similar or exactly the same. So we're going to look through some examples in this video and in your homework in which you're mostly going to be looking for those two things: incomplete citations and then same or too similar structure. And then you're going to do some rewriting to try to get them into different structures with complete credit. So here's a made-up example. You could directly quote something. Let's say the direct quotation is, "Children in the control group performed worse on the toy sorting task than children in the experimental group." I don't know if it says that anywhere. I just made it up. Put two authors on there, Smith and Smith. So an improper way to paraphrase this, one really easy one would be to cite it wrong, but another one would be like we have here, in which we say the control group performed worse than the experimental group on the sorting task. This is too close. It's maybe I may be splitting a hair by thinking about a results statement like this. You probably wouldn't get dinged for this kind of paraphrasing, but it's maybe just an extreme example to keep you aware of the edges of these kinds of ideas. Perhaps a more proper way to paraphrase that would be to go further from the structure of the original sentence. So rather than saying control group performed worse, you would say the experimental group performed the task more quickly than the control group, something like that. So that also, in addition to changing up the structure, gives a little more information. The reader gets to know that the crucial measurement there is time, rather than just finding out that one group performed worse than the other. So when you read a paper and you seek to paraphrase sentences or sections of it, we have to think about a couple things along the way. The first is your conceptual knowledge. You have to understand what you're reading in order to be able to paraphrase it. So if you're reading a sentence and you want to describe what's going on in it in your own writing, but you don't get it, you don't quite know what they're saying, it's going to be really, really hard to paraphrase. So my recommendation is to read it over and over again, or choose some other section, or describe the finding or the piece of methodology or whatever it is that you're trying to paraphrase as differently as you can. Try to come up with a much simpler description than the one they're offering if you are having trouble understanding it yourself. Or move away from the paper you've chosen if you have that option, or seek help. Get in touch with a professor, get in touch with a classmate, talk about what's going on in the sentence and the paragraph so that you understand it, so that you can write out your paraphrase accurately. That's probably one of the bigger mistakes that I see students make, is they try to pull a paragraph from a paper into their own by paraphrasing, and they don't quite understand it clearly enough, and they end up saying the opposite sometimes, or just something that's too different to the original. You also want to try to stay as concise as possible. Try to avoid wordiness. One way to paraphrase is to just add a bunch of extra junk around the words that are in the original publication. And all that does is make your writing more confusing for your readers. Try not to use more words than you need to convey the specific, the precise meaning that you intend. So my advice is to maybe have an underlined section of an article. Have a look at, say you've got a sentence, you're like, this is a good sentence. I need to present this exact fact in my writing as well. So my advice would be to read it, read the rest of the paper, finish off, try to rewrite the underlined phrase from your memory without looking at the article itself. And then let the idea rest, and then compare your sentence to the one in the paper and decide whether you need to tweak it to make it more accurate, to make sure it aligns with the sentence, or whether you need to tweak it to make it more different if it is too structurally close to the sentence in the original paper. So think about all three of these things in the context of this iterative process of writing that we're going to be dealing with all semester. Writing is a process. It involves many, many drafts. It involves lots of different feedback from hopefully different sources if you can, but at least lots of different instances of your own feedback. Go through and make a second and third and fourth draft of even a single sentence, and that will make your writing massively improved. Often people who call themselves bad writers are just people who don't have the time or haven't worked to edit and redraft writing enough times yet. It happens for everybody. Certain papers take us longer, take us more drafts. Certain people write more drafts than other people. None of these people are good or bad at writing due to this. The only thing that determines that is our willingness to work, our willingness to go through all these sometimes painful iterations and drafts. So as you go through these next couple, as I go through these slides in the video, I advise you to pause the video, read the entry, and try to paraphrase it. And while I'll sort of look at it, I'll come up with a paraphrase myself. You can come up with, and you can have a think about whether you like mine or yours better, and what you might do to change one or the other. So this is from a documentary about Jacques Cousteau. The Antarctic is the vast source of cold on our planet, just as the sun is the source of our heat, and it exerts tremendous control on our climate. The cold ocean water around Antarctica flows north to mix with warmer water from the tropics, and its upwellings help cool both the surface water and our atmosphere. The fragility of this regulating system is now threatened by human activity. I would say something like, a major source of cooling water and air on Earth is the South Pole. Water from the South Pole serves to cool not only surface water, but also air in the atmosphere. But this is less successful. This process is less successful with the advent of climate change, modern climate change. Something like that. Here's another. Of the more than 1,000 bicycling deaths each year, 3/4 are caused by head injuries. Half of those killed are school-aged children. One study concluded that wearing a bike helmet can reduce the risk of head injury by 85%. In an accident, a bike helmet absorbs the shock and cushions the head. So this is from a Consumer Report article on bike helmets. 750 people die from a head injury on a bike every year in the U.S. If we wore bike helmets, we could reduce that risk, the risk of injury in such accidents, around 85%. It's not a perfect one, but that's one version of a way you can represent most of what's here. I left out the school-age children part. If you wanted to include that, it would depend on your goal as a writer there. If you were writing about kids or if you were writing about adults, you might choose to in or exclude that sentence. So let's go through a couple of the most common errors people make when they are paraphrasing. The first one is, we've already mentioned, and it's wordiness. People write things like, looking back in retrospect, I can't remember a summer of my childhood when I didn't spend most of the day outdoors getting into trouble. You probably see the main problem there, and it is that that sort of preface that is looking back in retrospect. You could shorten it and say just one of those two things, or you could probably even remove it entirely. Because we're talking about summers in your childhood. We know you're looking back, and we know it's in retrospect. Because our treasury officer was stuck at the airport, we postponed the meeting until later. See a problem there? It's in that ending, and it's that if you postpone the meeting, it is till later. That's what postpone means. So you could say move the meeting later or postpone the meeting. Here's another wordiness example. The inadequate supply of pasta salad was not enough to feed the 24 people who showed up to the club's inaugural meeting. Do you see a repetitive aspect of that? Well, if we know the supply is inadequate, we already know it's not enough. So we could say one of the two of those. I would probably take out the word inadequate. Another common error is verb choice. People tend to choose weak verbs when they're paraphrasing sometimes. They might write something like, there are 12 items on the test. Participants were instructed to complete all the items. So this is also sometimes called passive voice. Participants were instructed. You see this in news reporting a lot too, where people kind of remove the agency of the human in the sentence. And so my advice would be to avoid those kind of verbs and just use the verb that's already there. We already have complete in this sentence. So let's say participants completed a 12-item test. That also has the handy side effect of removing some extra wordiness. You could go along with these examples, by the way, and try to fix them yourself by pausing while the orange box is on the screen and then trying to rewrite it yourself before you see the next one. So here's another passive voice weak verb example. Participants were instructed to fill out the survey. How might you change this one? I would go back to the verb complete, probably. Participants completed the survey. You could also say something like, researchers instructed participants to complete the survey. Give agency to the people in the sentence, basically, rather than just kind of having a passive thing happen. Participants were instructed, like it washed over them. Well, who instructed them? Try to keep to like a 16-word limit on sentences. Even less is always nice. But here's an example of a really long one. The researchers wanted to see if participants could think about faces while also thinking about objects before responding to the test prompt. Whew, a bunch of stuff going on in there. It's a lot to remember as a reader when you go through a sentence that's that complicated. Here's a rewrite. Researchers investigated participants' ability to simultaneously imagine faces and objects, and then end the sentence, start a new one. Afterwards, participants responded to a test prompt. Here's another idea. Researchers instructed participants to remember faces and objects before responding to a test prompt. Says the same thing, but sounds a lot less intimidating because it's so much less wordy. Another common error you see is an unclear antecedent. So here, the researchers instructed participants to complete a 12-item survey. They something, something, something. Now, in this case, it is going to be unclear who they is because we have both researchers and participants in the previous sentence. So you want to say participants, if that's who you're talking about. Or researchers, if that's who you're talking about. Another common error is ensuring or losing track of the continuity of an idea. And this happens through things like conjunctive adverbs sometimes for folks. They use them as transitional devices and lose track of what they mean. So you want to make sure that if you use afterward, the thing you're talking about happens after the thing you just mentioned. It's not always the case. People lose track of that when they write. Therefore should be used only after you've kind of built to a major conclusion. Whereas should only be used when you're changing topics or when you're talking about the opposite of what you just were. So make sure that you're using those, especially those kind of like $4 and $5 transitional words in the way that to mean what they mean. You don't just throw them in as transitions. Make sure that you're throwing them in as meaningful transitions. A great resource on that is Purdue's online writing lab website. The link to directly to the chats about conjunctive adverbs is on the screen here. And I'll share one other link with you. This is the discussion of academic honesty and plagiarism at Bowdoin College. There's a similar page at A&M San Antonio on our website. There's actually a little classlet you can take from the Academic Honesty website. I recommend you go and do that if you like. We'll talk. You've heard about academic honesty probably in the psych major course already, but if you haven't, it can be easier to accidentally plagiarize than we might think. So make sure that you are fully educated about how to avoid those pitfalls, and so that really the best way to do that is to become a really great paraphraser, and that's my advice here. So thanks for watching the paraphrasing video. See you next time.